Hello.
Yeah, it works now.
Okay. Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Sorry, I apologize. The app just froze.
Oh yeah. No, don't worry about it. So yeah. So you said that after last week's conversation, you wanted to go more in depth on like a specific subject. There are a few people here who I don't think were here last week. So just to summarize, last week I talked to Elias about the issue of communication among like different sects on the left, about how sometimes there are a lot of people who one of the major strengths of the left is our ability to work through our differences and collaborate towards developing some sort of synthesis ideas that can better address like specific conditions. And in order to do that, we have to treat each other in good faith. So that was part of what we talked about. And then the other part of what we talked about is we talked a little bit about anarchism and Marxism, and whether or not like a socialist state is something that is necessary or not. And yeah, I was wondering if there was like a specific direction you wanted to go from there, or yeah.
Yeah, from last week, like I rewatched that during the week, and good Lord, I was very nervous. Like, hopefully
Okay.
today it would be different. And yeah, I was all over the place, and I generally am bad at sticking to one point or thought because I branch out a lot usually. I hope today would be more organized. I have a little bullet points in front of me so that you know we stay on a certain track. Uh, maybe discuss those bullet points the way we both feel about them. If you're up for it.
Yeah, sure, that works fine for me. There's a question for you in chat. Um, because Yomain asked, because their internet is breaking up. Are you a Syrian Marxist or an Assyrian Marxist? They didn't hear properly the first time. Or Assyrian.
Syrian.
Okay.
Syrian.
Yeah. Okay. I did actually have one question for you that I realized that I wanted to ask. I sort of meant to ask last week, but there really wasn't a good time for it. If you don't mind me asking real quick, I have heard some things from like you said you were like a Christian Syrian, is that correct?
On paper, yeah.
Yeah, on paper. I well like um I have heard that I'm wondering what your stances on the YPG, because I have heard that some like Christian Syrians don't look very highly on them because of like some like activities in the region. I personally don't know much about it myself. So as someone who's maybe potentially more informed on it, do you have like a strong opinion on them?
I actually, that was one of the points I was gonna bring up
Oh, okay.
with you because since you're an anarchist and I've seen many videos now of anarchists, openly supporting the Rojava
Yeah.
in northeastern Syria, and I wanted to get to the bottom of it personally since I'm from that region, and at the same time. I have a few things to say about the subject. If you're up for it, we can start with that. If
Sure, yeah, because like let me give you an idea of where I'm coming from, right? So most of like the information that I have about like when we're talking about regions and conflict and like places like Syria or like Hong Kong or Brazil or like and any sort of like area that is foreign to me, right? It's very hard to get accurate information because there's sort of a vested interest in all sides to like have like lie about what's
absolutely.
happening. So it's I am very much reliant when like forming my opinion of movements abroad on like people who have more direct experience like in the region to tell me exactly what is happening.
Yeah, I mean, still, what I'm gonna say now is still subjective, but
Right.
at least you can say that here's a Marxist from that region, and that's what he thinks.
Yeah.
Maybe that'll do you some use
Yeah.
in like a general conversation. However, I so as far of of myself, like what I know about Rojava is like in addition to being a Syrian, I also like read the news, especially the leftist news. The way the Rojava are portrayed to be doing, that anarchist commune in northeastern Syria, and with noticeable successes, and it's now like many Western anarchists also travel to Rojava regions, and they volunteer to fight alongside them against ISIS and whatnot. Um, so to me, that is interesting. Actually, that is a very interesting case to discuss about, an attempt towards anarchism, at least as far as Rojava are concerned. Now, I never lived in areas where right now they're under the control of Rojava. I've never lived there, but I do know some general general traits, characteristics of, people there, their ethnicity, their religion, their, basic general numbers, if you like to call it that. For me, the case of Rojava is, or YPG as they call it, YPG, is interesting because right now, there is a circumstance, right? So the YPG are mainly, the Kurds are mainly in control of that faction or entity, and they have ties with the PKK, which is the Turkish Kurdish, the Kurdistan Workers Party, which is which originally operates in southeastern Turkey and was historically in constant conflict with the Turkish government, and the Turkish government was, cracking down heavily on them and their areas. As far as YPG goes, they wanted to separate from Syria. They wanted their own state at first, because what happened was when ISIS emerged in 2013, late 2013, and started to literally swallow large areas of territory in Iraq and Syria due to the vacuum of other factions, let's say. The Syrian army was directed to withdraw from Kurdish areas, and that was a move from the regime. I mean, some people calculate it as a conspiracy, like, yeah, this is to sow even more divisiveness within Syria and to make sure that people in the coast, his people, support him properly and whatnot, right? The army withdrew, so the Kurds had to protect themselves, had to defend themselves against ISIS. And they took whatever they could from, militaristic aid. At first, they were basically basic weapons, like light firearms. And they had aid also from, from other Kurdish elements in the region, and they managed to push ISIS back. And then the U.S., saw an opportunity to enter the Syrian conflict on the ground for the first time. So they took that opportunity, even if it meant they had to work with, quote unquote, socialists. Because, as far as ideology goes, the YPG, as far as I know, they are one form or another of a Marxist slash, socialist movement. At least the Kurdistan Workers Party, the Kurdistan Workers Party in Turkey, that's what they represent. So what was interesting to me, though, was, at first they wanted a state. At first, they wanted to separate from the Syrian territory and to form a state. Turkey is, against that. Turkey would never accept that. And we're seeing now, up until now, Turkey is still determined to crack down on any Kurdish elements near its borders. So at first, the Kurds wanted to separate and form their own state. I mean, if you had to ask me, that state would have been, if it went well with their ideology, that state would have been a socialist state. It would have been, that style of a state.
Yeah, right.
So after they've realized that the regional atmosphere, political and geopolitical atmosphere, wasn't gonna let them form their own state, they resorted to anarchist principles to self-organize, and they have been successful in many ways. In other ways, there needs to be refinement, and they even have some contradictions. For example, but those contradictions, I mean, in a war zone, you can totally understand them. Some of these contradictions, for example, like, yeah, they don't have a state, but the Asayish, which are, they call it the People's Protection Unit. So they pretty much make warrantless arrests. They can make warrantless arrests anywhere in the areas where they control. And they're in a war zone. So, and also ISIS previously operated in that area. So that is understandable. Yeah, and one more thing, for the Christians, I think the Christians don't quite, they don't even know enough about the YPG to actually, hate them. I think the Christians are more, the Christians, because in Syria, the church as an establishment, as an institution, has way more influence in Christian society and Christian communities than, for example, in the West. So if the cardinal of, for example, Syria goes out in public and say, like, yeah, we support Assad, so most likely most Christians who are, really committed to going to church every Sunday and whatnot, they will be pro-Assad. Just because that guy said so, right? It's pretty tribal at this point. But I wouldn't think that they have a problem with the YPG per se. The YPG actually, at least they are part of what is known as the SDF, or the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is, a multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious group fighting in northeastern Syria to, at least that's what they say, to operate in a democratic way, to rule Syria in a democratic way. And they don't clash with Assad's army. I mean, there were clashes in the past, but they were pretty sporadic, and there weren't like any frontline conflicts, between the Assad army and the Syrian Democratic Forces. So far, as far as minorities go, the regime, sorry, let me correct here. The Arab minorities, for example, even like Christian minorities and other religious minorities, they still they still lean towards Assad more than they lean towards any other faction, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I generally speaking, like I don't have a good what like with all of these movements, right? Like there's always going to be some like fuzziness around the edges of it from like my perspective as someone who not only doesn't have firsthand knowledge of the group itself, but doesn't have firsthand knowledge of the conditions that the group exists within, right? Like I a lot of like the internal politics of Syria are a mystery to me
Sorry,
specifically. So
I don't
like
mean
that's
to
a
interrupt you,
yeah, okay,
but I'm gonna send a link in the chat right now.
okay,
It's useful if you wanna. That's
yeah. Let me
like
take a look
a
at this.
live map for the situation and the territorial situation in Syria.
Alrighty. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean this like I don't know when talking about like any sort of foreign politics, like the only info I can really feel like I can trust is like what are the conditions like for the people directly, like individuals directly affected by it, because like both state entities and like spokespeople for non-state entities have like usually have a vested interest in declaring like this like protracted struggle of two conflicting ideologies where one may align with more socialist tendencies and one may not, or something along those lines. I
Right.
it's sort of like it's sort of like both like state or administrative institutions have a vested interest in playing up certain aspects of the conflict. So I this is like helpful information for me for like getting more info on like what the situation is actually like. Yomain says we use this map
Right.
in a couple of my grad classes. That's interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
Um, yeah, I just wanted to note that as I said last week, like there is no good answer in Syria. There's not like here's the these people are totally on the correct side.
Great.
They're saying all the right things and they want to do all the right things. No one, I don't think this is why it's so problematic. And in fact, I feel like there would never be any positive change in my country or in any other developing country with certain strategic situation where the West or mainly the United States would just go in and either topple a government or stop a revolt, for example, from happening by the use of force or by supporting the local dictator at that place. So I don't really have high hopes about any like liberation movement
Yeah.
if the U.S. foreign policy did not change. It has to change. It has to change somehow for other people, other populations around the world to be able to function at least, or to start organizing towards toppling a dictator, or moving forward progressively towards a more democratic, a more a working class oriented society. Uh, it is just, in my opinion, it is just fantasy to believe like there could ever be a revolution in Syria, not necessarily a Marxist or a left wing revolution. Like any form of revolution would not be feasible if you have an extremely powerful external actor coming in, literally weighing in on the situation, literally changing all the rules of the game. Uh, to me, that's just fantasy.
Yeah, I sort of feel the same way about like the success of the revolution is dependent on external factors as well. U.S. foreign policy has essentially been under standing orders to topple anyone who's even remotely unfriendly to U.S. interests, and typically they install someone worse because their only concern is will you support the U.S. and do you have a semi-legitimate um, claim to power in the region. And typically speaking, like we can see this has led to dictators worldwide, and U.S. intervention is definitely something that no matter what side they intervene in Syria, I can see U.S. interventionism only leading to things becoming worse. Um, for both the people who live there and for the people in the United States as well, although to a much lesser extent. Um,
Yeah, I, I just I read a comment by Finlord.
yeah,
I read an article by an Assyrian source saying that Assyrians were being extorted by the YPG, and that had died down, and now Assyrians are paying the YPG to be smuggled out of the region, but that is reducing the population of Assyrians. I mean, I want to, I mean, I wouldn't be, that's not, something to be unexpected because it's a place like Syria, a country like Syria, you're not only speaking about clear, defined factions. Sometimes, especially in multi-ethnic, multi-religions areas, you're talking about an extremely complex situation. Uh, I mean, that could have happened. I have no idea. I've heard a few things here and there that suggest that, but I can never confirm it because there's a reason for that. You see, for example, if there was a Christian minority in Al-Hasaka, for example, which is a city in the Kurdish-controlled areas, and that Christian would see, because we all know, like, also the YPG, they're also mainly Muslims, right? They're, because that's the population there. It's mostly Muslims. So we have to be careful about Christians saying bad things about that faction or that faction just because of their religion or just because of their, preset beliefs or preset teams that they've chosen. So in situations like this, we need to be extremely, scrutinizing information like that. And I wouldn't like put it, as an impossible thing, but that's something to think about at least.
yeah, it's all like I said, like it's very hard to find reliable information about a lot of these things. It's by nature obfuscated, and it's gotten a lot better in recent years with like the development of like people who are in and around the region to be able to um communicate like directly, hey, this is exactly what's happening, without it having to go through like the entire media industry and being filtered for the narrative that they want to present. So by
Right.
allowing more direct communications, we can sort of get a more accurate picture going of what's going on now. But it's still like we've now arrived at the opposite conclusion, where if everyone has access to share directly their information, then you get flooded with a lot of junk, and it's hard to filter out what is real and what is not. Which is
Absolutely.
probably a better problem to have, but it's still a problem.
I mean, I see that. I totally agree. I see that, like, for example, on also the left and the right. For example, regarding conspiracy theories, like a lot of conspiracy, quote unquote, conspiracy theories in the past few decades, where leftists said, like, look, here's, for example, the Iraq War, one of the quote unquote conspiracies, being peddled in leftist spheres was that this there's no evidence for that. They're not going to show it, and this war is totally unjustified, and blah blah blah, which turned out to be completely true. On the other hand, there is right-wing conspiracies like QAnon and things like that, which uses like a similar rhetoric, but they use that extremely maliciously to pump disinformation campaigns out there. And centrists, what centrists do is just equate the two being equally valid, and just like, you guys, the left and the right, you both are crazy, you're
Right.
both are conspiracy theorists, you're not living in reality. While on the other hand, history literally is proving many left-wing predictions, let's say, to be because I think there is a sound approach to view, like it's like you said last week, like
Yeah.
there is a lens that you can use to look at these things, to process information that you get. For example, the what Finlord said, the Assyrian situation, like, I don't say it's impossible. I don't say I know it's true, right? As abstract information, it doesn't play out in the powers, in the struggle, in the conflict within Syria, right? It's a minor detail. It is. There are, if you want to look for things to criticize the YPG on, you'll find more concrete stuff than this. You will find it. So if you want to critique them, you can critique them in other solid base critiques. But as far as the wider conflict goes, such information doesn't really affect anything. It doesn't really change anything.
Right.
The YPG are still in a war zone. They're still being threatened every day by Turkey. Actually, there's still clashes. And Erdogan yesterday just said that he will soon launch a military campaign to, quote unquote, make northern Syria safe. There's no conflict in northern Syria, and he still wants to make it safe by actually
Right.
injecting conflict. So that's my view on the situation.
Yep. That seems reasonable. And again, like going back to like the more general point, I guess, of like a left wing versus right wing conspiracy theories. I find that, like, typically speaking, when we look at like a left wing conspiracy theory, right, it's typically not necessarily involving a shadowy cabal of individual people who are all plotting to directly control the world. It's more of an analysis of how our
Exactly,
current
yes.
power structures tend to consolidate power without the conscious involvement of any individual person involved, and how we can like actually see this playing out in the real world, as you said. So there's definitely, I think,
Exactly,
like a
exactly. And
qualitative difference.
yeah, and I don't know. Actually, I've watched like a documentary on the Iraq War the other day, and like really, like the left at that time really said like, this is bogus, this is nothing, but they had no evidence right before the war actually happened, and certain classified documents were leaked and blah blah blah. Everybody knew like it was all fugazi, and it's just a ploy
Please?
to get in
You're
that
not
country.
please?
Uh, why, like, it's weird, like the absence of internet back then, I guess, the way it is, the way it exists now, I guess, didn't let that information go out there, like, hey, like we said it was this way and it turned out to be true, so you dismissed us, the mainstream media dismissed us, and now we're correct. So do we get points for that, or
Right.
I don't know. It was weird for me also, but yeah.
Sorry, I have to real quickly step away for just a second, take care of this dog, but we'll be right back.
Yeah, sure, sure.
Okay, so I don't know what that was about. Sorry, the dog was just barking at nothing, I think. What is the public opinion of Marxism in Syria? Something Finlord asked. If you don't want to, if you have more like things that you prepared on, you don't have to ask. You don't have to go into incredibly detail on like these audience questions, or we can like save them for the end if you have like a particular like subject you'd like to talk about first. Is there like some particular way you'd prefer to handle that?
Sorry, I got cut out. Sorry. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, so we're getting like audience questions, and like Finlord is asking, what is the public opinion on Marxism in Syria? If you have specific like points you'd like to talk about first, then we can like defer audience questions, or you don't have to answer them if like you don't really have like a thing. But I'd be interested in hearing the answer
No,
to that
that's
as well.
okay.
Okay.
As long as I'm not giving away too much information.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm still a Syrian. I go
Right.
like I could go back to Syria, and get arrested, and then I'm gonna blame you for it. Yeah, actually, uh, uh, the view of Marxists in Syria, well, we don't say Marxists in Syria, we just say communists. Everyone is lumped in under that umbrella term. We say communist. And people's view of them is generally uh, uh, either non-existent because of extreme political oppression. Like nobody cares about like political parties or movement when you have, when you're living in a society where everyone you meet is a possible is a possible state asset that can ruin your life, right, and put you in prison or something. So it is difficult to operate in these circumstances to start asking these questions, these political questions and whatnot. But as far as terminology, like, yeah, people say there are communists. They're generally viewed in when you talk policy, they're viewed in a good way. When you speak in general terms, they immediately say that these people are atheists. These are not. This is not what the Syrian people want. We won't have a religious movements transforming into this country into a secular country or whatnot. These are a big portion of the population whom are religious, and especially like the McCarthyism campaigns in the West, smeared communism to be many things they're not. They were also smeared in the Middle East, but only in a different way, because in the Middle East, religion is one of the priorities, one of the main drivers of life in that region. So you have to appeal to that if you want to smear or if you want to prop something up, right? So yeah, they've put the big bad Soviet Union like as an anti-religious freedom entity, and so up until now, people still think that. People still think that, yeah, all Marxists, all communists are atheists, and we shouldn't trust them, and stuff like that.
Alrighty. Yeah, so did you have like I'm interested in like hearing like what other like bullet point sort of things you have. If there's like a particular order you'd like to speak in things in, then that's fine with me. Um, any other topics that you said you had that you wanted to speak about?
So I thought since last week we've discussed anarchism, right? And we started talking about the state. What's the definition of a state? Is it necessary and whatnot? So I wanted to talk to you about a few things. The first would be is uh, like. Uh, you've already you've said last time that you understand that in many places and in many situations the state do provide services and certain activities that goes towards to the service of a portion of society or the whole of society, or it can be used as a force for good. But your main issue was the inherent characteristics of the state. One of them where that it creates this class conflict, sorry, between the people who are governing society and those who are governed. Am I portraying this accurately?
Yeah, that's more or less it.
Uh, yeah. So what I wanted to respond to that was let's say that this actually makes sense, as I said last week, because there will be a class conflict in this situation, but you can organize society in a way where, for example, I always go back to the framework, point or argument, because I like an analogy to the framework argument, which is, you have an empty room and one door, and you have to break that door and get out, and you can't break it by yourself. You need to have tools to break it. So if I don't put any tools for you to break that door, you're going to remain in there. We can't expect the result. You're going to remain in there forever, right? Because you won't be able to break out. For example, if I put certain tools for you to break through that door, I can also predict that you'd be able, for example, to break out. If I put, for example, tools that are not helping you, tools that are, that doesn't necessarily give you any other advantage than opening the door, like a key. If I give you a key, you can open the door without breaking anything and you'd still not be dangerous. I like that analogy, and I like to apply it, to bureaucracy. I like to apply it to the positions of power, to power structures, where you still have, for example, a functional requirement for that position in the bureaucracy, but you can mitigate any actual power or authority those people have on other people, especially like in the same way, for example, worker co-ops are formed. For example, they're likely to elect a manager. That manager has functional power and authority over the employees, but the employees can rebuke that power just like that, just by electing another dude or voting him out of his job. So my problem with these positions of power is actually how to get there, how to get to a position where people are able to make that decision that they need that person to be replaced, or what way you can transform, for example, the press to be able to look through 100%, for example, transparent public records in that state, to actually, for example, put useful information in the hands of people as a way to fight corruption, for example. Like one of the, I wanted to bring that up as an example also. For example, in the Soviet Union, the bureaucrats had a lot of power. They had lots of authority, lots of power. But especially before the perestroika, uh, uh, um, like bureaucrats, Soviet bureaucrats, big Soviet officials, weren't able to actually accumulate wealth because they have power, they have authority, but even in the framework of the Soviet Union, there was nothing constitutional. There was nothing like there is no operating feasible way for one guy to actually amass a big wealth and then suddenly disappearing with that wealth. They had frameworks in place to fight that. Uh, in my opinion, they didn't go far enough. They didn't go nearly as far enough. They made lots of mistakes. They literally took the wrong decision on many occasions throughout their existence. But we can look at that and say this is a, a win for the argument of frameworks, right?
Yeah.
So my final point on this topic would be uh, I agree with anything you have to say about the inherent stuff within the state, right? Um, well, just like I agree that there is inherent stuff within capitalism. Now, in the case of capitalism, I want to abolish it because I can see in front of me a way more efficient. I'm speaking pure data here. Like we can make, it's like what you also said last week. We can if we can get rid of all the resource wasting, time wasting, labor wasting modes of production under capitalism. If we can get rid of that, we can actually get a pretty productive society, a pretty efficient society. And I totally agree with that. But when it comes to the state, I don't really currently, at least, when I say currently, I mean in my lifetime, I don't see any other way, especially coming from a country where you have 18 different ethnicity, you have more than a dozen religions, and these differences are which I already know they're being exaggerated by the system, by the capitalist system, one way or another. But still, when you abolish capitalism, these things won't just go away with it. They'll remain, and one can argue they'll even in the most perfect of worlds, there will be remnants here and there of these things, and you need to have tools in place to combat that. Those tools, in my opinion, require authority. Now, that authority, my problem with that authority would be accountability and transparency. That's the two main things I focus on. But first, I would like to hear what you think about what I said.
Yeah. So I'm gonna. There were a few things there. The first one was one of your analogies was like in a worker cooperative, workers will typically elect some sort of managerial position, but it's less coercive because they can recall the manager. And I would agree that's much less coercive than our current system. However, I would say that like a more like viewing this through an anarchist framework, I would say that typically this would be a form of organizing where like the authority of the manager themselves, even if you can vote on who is the manager, that authority is necessarily problematic in certain aspects. What I would say, like these bureaucratic positions, like you said, there's like a demonstrated need for them. However, the structures that the bureaucracy exists under can be more democratically managed. Like for example, under this worker co-op example, I would say that just being able to elect and recall the manager at will would not be enough. I would say that in addition to the democratic process of selecting a manager, the policies and that the policies and goals that the manager seeks to uphold, like productivity requirements, like scheduling, like all of these different bureaucratic tasks.
Oh, sure, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah,
It's
so
set by workers, right?
right, and at that point, it
Yeah.
becomes much less coercive and much more like a
Of course,
yeah.
of course, I'm for all that.
Okay.
I'm for all that, but I just
Right.
said it as an example on this
Yeah,
particular.
okay. I just want to make sure we're on the same page about that.
Yeah, yeah.
And then when it comes to like short-term feasibility of certain things, like you said, like there's very real conflicts in like your country, for example, that won't go away after capitalism, like racial and ethnic and religious divides are things that predate capitalism, and they will probably last beyond capitalism, and we need to be able to address those. I will say, number one, in terms of short-term goals, I want to be pretty clear about this. I actually am typical when I speak about like short-term anarchist policies and how I believe like in the short-term anarchist organizing is the best way to achieve change. When I typically speak of this, I'm typically speaking of it from the framework of like my country, the United States, because I feel like that's where I have the most reliable information about like what I can see working and what I can see not working, and that's where I also see my input having the most value, right? Like I'm never going to live in Syria, probably. I don't think that I have any stake. I don't think I have any right to dictate to the Syrians, you need to organize this way, you need to be anarchist, and if you're a state socialist and that's actually improving your lives and it's removing a lot of the cruelties in your life, that's bad. I that would be ridiculous of me to say. So yeah. So when it comes to like short-term feasibility of, well, we need the state in this particular example, I leave that to the people who are like living on the ground there to decide, and will support whatever sort of framework arises that seems to be improving like the quality of a life for the people who live there. For now, like you said, there's no real uniformly good option in Syria. It does seem to me like Rojava seems to be the most ethical of the current options, but even they have problems, as you said.
Absolutely.
But if there was like, say, a state socialist government that arose in like Syria that looked like it was able to sustain itself, that looked like it was improving the material conditions of like the workers there in very substantial ways, and was not enacting cruelties in order to do that, like, yeah, that's absolutely a good thing. In the as far as like short-term organizing goes. So trying to think of what came after that I had.
There was just Finlord said, I don't love the Soviet Union as an example of successful communist policy, even if I was a Marxist who was moderately pro-government. You don't have to like the Soviet Union, and you don't have to hate the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is a historic, attempt or experiment, and that's how we should view it. It had its successes. We had to learn from that. It had its many, many mistakes and negativities, and we have to also learn from that and to avoid it. I can't say I don't like this, I love this, I hate that. It's irrelevant. It's an experiment, and it's historic. It was there at a certain point in time. So the best thing you can do out of it is learn from what they did, in a good and the good and the bad.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with I would tend to agree with that framing of it. Like the Soviet Union, I think I'm not like an expert on the Soviet Union, but from what I've heard of it, like again, like there are certain aspects of it that are worthy of analysis. Even the bad parts of it are worthy of like critical analysis to determine why was this potentially enacted, what went wrong here. It's very important, I think, to take a nuanced take of the USSR, even if after your conclusion, after your nuanced analysis, is the USSR is bad, which it tends to be my perspective on it. The nuance, the analysis itself has value beyond the conclusion.
Of course, I cannot go on. I cannot go full on record and say the Soviet Union was bad, because I'd be a hypocrite if I do that, because my country would probably not be here right now if the Soviet Union didn't aid my country for free in its war in 1973 against Israel.
Yeah.
This is also a factor. Just like a Cuban person, if you ask a Cuban person about the Soviet Union, they'll probably tell you that that it was fine,
Yeah.
because Cuba is one of those countries that received a lot from the Soviets to actually be able to hold on against a major superpower like the United States for that long.
Cuba is an interesting one to me because I think Cuba is actually one of the state socialist projects that I am most in support of. Not that it's perfect, but it does seem like, especially
Yeah,
compared to other Caribbean countries in the region, it does seem to be performing much better than them. And in some, like I think I said this last week too, to some extent, Cuba is also performing better than
yeah,
Puerto Rico, which is the United States. Um, uh,
yeah, exactly.
but at the same time, like the USSR is responsible for that, for aiding Cuba and allowing them to, like, without the USSR, Cuba would have almost immediately been taken over by the US. However, um
Yeah,
the I do think that to some extent the US is also responsible for mitigating the sort of like the proximity of Cuba to the US and the distance from Russia um sort of mitigated some of the negative aspects that other like Eastern Bloc countries had with collaborating with the USSR, where a lot of like oppressive sort of policies were enacted from above from Soviet leadership, that had to be enforced in these other countries, without any say from the local or with a reduced say from the local population. I think Cuba's distance and like again like the U.S. can't exploit Cuba in during the Cold War because of the USSR's protection of Cuba. In some ways, the USSR had impact on Cuba was also minimized because the United States was right there as well, and they had to. Their primary concern was protecting the Cuba's safety from the U.S. rather than enforcing their own control over it in certain ways. So I don't know. This is not something that I am
I
100%
mean,
confident in saying like with a historical certainty like Cuba wouldn't exist if the US wasn't there. It just seems like it was a factor in the differences between like a sort of Cuban style socialist government and some of the ex-Soviet countries.
yeah, but I mean, there's a distinction, just a small detail here. Like,
Yeah.
also, if you look at the ideology of the Cuban Revolution, it was a little bit different.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a known disagreement between Che Guevara and Fidel Castro about the Soviet role in the Cuban Revolution. And Che Guevara actually had to go and meet with Soviet officials to actually ask them um, to mitigate or to decrease their interference within Cuba and with Cuban affairs, to allow more room for the revolution to build the country. And Castro was against that. Actually, Castro was for more of a Soviet style thing. But even though Che Guevara left, but this sentiment remained. Like, the Cubans wanted to make something different, and as you said, they have really, like, they have a lot of success. Like,
Yeah.
they're really impressive. I mean, even like when you usually compare them to other socialist states, other socialist experiments. Even their human rights record isn't perfect, of course, but I think the last time I've read something about the topic, it wasn't like you can't now you can't actually put it as in the same category as, for example, Singapore or the Gulf states or or Indonesia or any of those other countries which have like actual literal dictators, and these dictators have no intention in making the lives of the population better in any way, shape, or form. And I think that's a distinction. I think the Cuban government, even now, at least they have the intent. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, yeah, I get what you mean by that. Yeah, that does make sense to me. So sorry, there
Yeah. So
was
what was your original point? You were using
right. Okay.
Cuba. Yeah.
I think that was just an aside that I had. Anyway, I think what I was actually going to speak on was so again, like the conditions in Syria are obviously very different than the U.S. So I'm not as very familiar with like the specific details of that situation. And I can't provide like an educated opinion on exactly what form of organizing would be best for Syria. However, I can talk a little bit about how I feel that anarchist organization, to me, seems like the best solution to ethnic divides as they exist in the United States. It's not the same thing, but it is like you say that like you said that to you the situation with like ethnic and religious conflicts in Syria would require a state in order to enact any sort of solution that doesn't lead to these causing major problems, and there needs to be tools to deal with them. I sort of believe that anarchism has access to a similar set of tools. One of the biggest set of tools is when we look at like the history of racial issues and in the United States. And again, this could be completely different in Syria. I can only speak from experience from my own country. A lot of the history of racial issues here is revolves around the idea of it revolves around slavery, which is pretty uniquely American, and the way it was implemented here, and specifically, it's directly tied to capitalism in ways where racial divides were used to prevent class solidarity between workers of different races, right? If you
Right.
have like if you have a black slave and a white worker who's working for barely enough to feed themselves, the white worker can look and say, well, at least I'm not a slave. Or Tanisi Coates
Yeah. Yeah.
said that with a slur that I'm not going to repeat. So
Exactly.
like
Yeah.
it's when we look at this, we can see that the racism has been enforced in the United States through historically through people are incentivized to partake in racism because it boosts their own status. If you are white, if your ethnic group is white, which the definition of that in the United States has changed over time. You have all sorts of advantages over people who are not white, and you can look at these advantages and you can see, well, I've got things pretty good right now. I don't need things to change because I am in a more privileged position in society, and this is done subconsciously for most people. It's a system of control where people operate to boost themselves up at the expense of others. However, if we look at like anarchist frameworks, we can see that pretty often speaking, people racist behavior has to be, it can't be rewarded if we ever want to stop it. So removing the structure of capitalism that encourages people to be racist is a necessary step in my eyes from abolishing racism. If you're no longer incentivized to participate in racist behavior, then you that removes like a lot of the reason to be racist. There's still cultural traditions that will persist after the economic framework supporting racism has ended. However, these cultural traditions, I believe, can be solved through collaborating with people from a diverse perspective of races. It's mostly like an exposure thing, in my eyes, where if you are interacting with other human beings on a day-to-day basis, and we can see from people who have been de-radicalized from extreme racist ideologies. Typically, what does it is from like forming like bonds of solidarity with other people who are of a different race than them. And anarchist organizing encourages direct collaboration between members of different races as a necessity of its function, um, in ways that I think are crucial for de-radicalizing racists. And I believe that that's one potential solution to a lot of like racial issues in the United States is literally just people working together and against the common enemy of like class struggle, right?
Right. And I just want to say, like, I think I can now put my finger on, the crucial point, which is, even from last Saturday, we've been discussing, and we can't, me and you, we can't seem to disagree, and at the
Right.
same time, we keep pushing to further, argumentation towards, trying to make sense of each person's beliefs, right?
Yeah.
So I think now I can probably put my finger on it and say that so the definition of a state is that entity or apparatus which has a monopoly on violence or authority, right? Is that accurate?
Yeah, it would be a group that both has monopoly on violence and that involves one small group of people one group of people enacting laws that govern another group of people. I believe that like direct democratic systems don't necessarily share that quality, even if like, sorry, I'm overcomplicating things. Yeah, you're right.
No, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please. This is actually
okay.
This is actually interesting.
So a lot of like direct democratic functions, like for example, if you have like a legal system that involves like the direct democratic control of all individuals, then in my eyes it ceases to have some of the essential problems of the state, which is that one group of people is making decisions for rules that govern another set of people that aren't directly involved in the decision-making process. I believe that being a direct participant in like the process of creating laws and enforcing laws and debating like various like legal issues is a necessity to like you learn how to do this successfully by doing it, right? You by participating in anarchist institutions where you are governing yourself, and through the process of direct democracy you are creating a legal framework that you can exist in directly. Then by doing that you socialize yourself to become the type of person who is capable of doing that. You learn. Anarcho-Pack is a very good video on a very good essay on this that she wrote into a video. It's just a reading of the essay, where she talks about how by participating in anarchist meetings, like by learning how to take minutes, by learning how to ensure that everyone has the ability to speak evenly, by learning to ask people and reach out to people directly, hey, what are your needs for us to live together? What are your needs for society, and what can you contribute to society? By each individual being directly involved in that process, we socialize ourselves into being like being able to complete this process, right? And this
Right.
Anarcho-Pack specifically ties this into a lot of like Marx's writing on human nature and human development, which I find very interesting, even though I haven't read enough Marx to really say that I have a very nuanced understanding of it.
Yeah, but that's I don't have a problem with that being,
Yeah.
as I said, as I said last week, in my belief, what we know now to be like the state has a monopoly on violence, right?
Yeah.
What we know now to be the state, the manifestations of a state, is confined to the frameworks of capitalism, of the global order, which is capitalism, right? So you have these states who are being, being malicious, not because not malicious in a like bad people are getting in. It's not that. Like the states themselves, as far as they are entities in their respective societies, they are depicting almost almost in every example, they're being completely malicious towards even their population. And there's for example no transfer. But what I'm trying to say is if you want to like abolish the state, okay, try first, for example, again, for people who did not watch last week's episode, I have no problem with anarchism, and I'm actually pretty sympathetic to it. And all these ideas of a better way to organize society in a more equitable way, I'm all for that. Like I have no problem with that. But to me, what makes sense to me is like we're in a certain situation right now. For example, I see bad things that are making the state act in a certain way.
Right.
I would, before I go ahead and abolish the state, I'd like to dismantle these frameworks and dismantle these tools that the states have, and then see if the state is actually really like a burden on society or not. Is it a burden on society? Yeah, it has a monopoly on it has a monopoly on violence. It has certain authority which would be applicable to certain individuals or certain groups of people, but it wouldn't be. Would it be? That's the question. Would it be in the same malicious mindset it is set up like it is set up right now? Because in my opinion, as I've stated last week, if we change the global order, if we move towards a global socialist centralized planned economy, for example, which is what I lean towards, I think, like, for example, automation would directly lead to more free time for workers, not more money for one individual like it is now in this system, right?
Right.
This is all planned, right? So if, for example, if a group of people in the desert, the Sahara Desert in Africa, for example, if suddenly, because of a certain environmental reason, they ran out of water, for example, that central body would do the planning necessary to move this population, no matter how big it is. You'd have infinite, like near infinite possibilities with this kinds of, synchronization between all the populations and all the groups of people across the globe. And I think when you have that, when you have like this one state, right, centralized state globally, it is, in my opinion, it is much easier to actually, for example, keep it accountable, to actually for example, enforcing certain, accountability measures in many ways. And as I said last week, this would involve a ton of technology,
Right.
which I know exists, right?
Right.
And I just, for example, there's a book called, I first heard about it on the Majority Report. It's called the uh, People's Republic of Walmart,
Yeah.
right? So this book just describes the kind of technology Walmart, companies like Walmart and Amazon uses to centrally plan the mini economy they have within that company, right? And to anybody who who say like, I have lots of people say like, yeah, we don't have this kind of technology. Like, this is absolute fantasy. This is delusional. We already have technologies that would make the most efficient that would run the most efficient economy we can imagine. With, of course, not by default. We have to work towards that. I'm jumping ahead of myself here,
Right.
but there needs to be a lot of frameworks in place to prevent degradation, to prevent abuse, to prevent all these sort of things. And to me, like after a while, like even for example, Lenin, when although what Lenin believed within himself like was different than a little different than what he wrote, but even Lenin, like, yeah, we're gonna have this socialist state and it will take us gradually towards this communist society where it is like stateless and even like the end goal of communism, you can say.
Right.
So that angle is extremely, in my view, the way I understand it, it is extremely close and similar to, I think, the anarchist world. Am I correct about that?
Yeah, so if we're talking about Lenin specifically, one of my big critiques of Marxist Leninism is the idea that the state will. So sorry, there are a few things here. I actually want to back up a little bit before I talk about Lenin.
Yeah, sure.
There's so you when you talk about like the state and then transition to talking about like a planned economy, I sort of like agree with the principles of planned economy as well. I just don't necessarily see a centralized state like central worldwide state planning network as being a more efficient solution to that than a planned economy involving that's more decentralized in its inputs and outputs. Like for example, we have each individual community decide what their needs are as a community and what they are able to produce as well. And by doing this, like we can incentivize people to produce more. Like for example, if you have a community that's able to produce like machining equipment, they are incentivized to produce as much machining equipment as needed, because it increases the productive capacity of other communes that are producing goods for them, which will increase the total like productive labor power of like the trade network as a whole, right? We can have like the same sort of centrally planned sort of we can have the same sort of centrally planned economic calculations, but decide like the inputs and outputs that each individual area requires and can produce through the process of direct democracy rather than having a state do all this planning as well. And it maybe it would take
You can have direct democracy in my example. You can have it in certain situations,
well, not
and also
it's it
using
direct
certain
democracy.
technology.
Direct democracy becomes infeasible if we're talking about at a global scale, right? What I'm advocating for instead is a more localized thing where communes can directly can through direct democracy like determine like what they are capable of like what their own production quotas are, and then from
Oh,
the
okay. Yeah.
yeah, and then from there they can also democratically determine the resources that they need for their that they need for themselves as well. And we have like a system where, hey, we're able to produce this much this many widgets, and they go to like a global decentralized distribution network, and they receive the widgets that they require from that same network that's managed. The entire network is managed locally through direct democracy rather than through one world state organization, where direct democracy becomes infeasible. If from my perspective, I don't think there's any
Right.
yeah.
That's even my main issue with like I
Yeah.
always again coming from Syria, I have I don't know if you want to call it a PTSD. Uh, I have an obsession with like I don't trust. For example, even now, if I meet another Syrian, I would immediately, automatically not trust him at first, at least. I
Yeah.
need to get to know him way, way more to be able to trust him or her, because as you know, in Syria, the situation, anybody can be an asset for the state, and it could be very dangerous. To talk about things you shouldn't talk about in front of certain people.
Right.
That I carry that with me now here, right? I can't help but say I feel a sense of a sense of scatteredness, if that's a word, in the image you're trying to portray for the anarchist world you're trying to suggest. For me, for example, last week I told you that I think we need to talk about collectivism versus individualism and what we both think about this
Yeah.
dichotomy, I'd like you to at least tell me, what do you think? I mean, last week you said something to the extent of like you do value highly the individual. I don't want to put
Yeah.
words in your mouth, so it's better that if you say it yourself. So
Sure. So I don't. My big thing is I don't see these two things as necessarily being in conflict, provided that the collective is the framework for the collective is designed in such a way that it can accommodate for both, right? So what we can have is we can have a situation where people acting off of individualist principles in order to like benefit themselves individually. What they must do is they in order to do that they benefit the collective, right? So we sort of have like a collect, like for example, I brought this briefly up earlier. If you
but
want
that's the
to
same argument of capitalists, right?
sort of, but their system doesn't actually do that. That's I think like um yeah, so for example, I would say that like if you want to either have more goods or spend less of your time working, if you want to essentially benefit from more like labor power in the collective, through one of these two methods, your best bet is to find some way to increase the total labor power available to that collective, right? So if you are able to develop like a machine that eases the burden of people working, you can either use that machine to produce more goods and therefore develop the economy of whatever trading network you're a part of, and from there increase the total productive capacity of the trading network so that you are receiving more goods in return. Or you can use that to maintain the status quo but have more free time available for whatever other things you might want to pursue as an individual. So we have a situation where like an individual's desire for like either material goods or for more time for like self-actualization leads them to take actions that benefit the community as a whole, and from there they are rewarded for it, rather than like the critique I would have of capitalism isn't that the whole idea of individuals benefit the collective and the collective benefits the individuals. The critique is that in capitalism, you mostly have individuals benefiting other individuals by having their surplus labor value stolen from them by those who currently own the means of production. They don't see any meaningful returns on their contribution to the productive capability of society as a whole.
Right.
Yeah. That's more or less my opinion on that.
Okay, so here's mine. I am personally a collectivist. Personally, I have a lot of nihilistic traits in my personality, and that have lots of reasons. One of the big reasons is that I'm an atheist. I don't necessarily see an inherent, goal which everybody has to have in life to actually, keep going forward in this life. For me, I like this analogy of the invention within woods. Like if you have a scientist or an artist who's an individual, and they go into like secluded woods somewhere, and they invent, for example, a cure for cancer, and then they die, no one ever finds them again. Can you look at planet Earth and say, like, has the cure for cancer, has it been invented, right?
Right.
The answer would be no, because the collective did not actually invent that. They don't actually have access to that yet, at least. So I like the meaning or philosophical meaning behind this analogy. And to me, the way I look at it, there wouldn't be any individual satisfaction without the validation of the group, and the validation of the group has like sometimes even biological effects on for example, the human brain, like for example, helping other people out, is actually one of the most fulfilling things you can ever do, and it's actually pretty rewarding. That's just an example. So, in my opinion, I'm pretty like I'm extremely careful when it comes to individuality, to the distinction. Peter Coffin has an amazing video, Individualism versus Individuality. It's awesome. I recommend it to everyone. It says a lot about what I think in this particular situation. What I hate is, brute individualism, which is the situation now, where you literally, even when you want to fight climate change, you have to have a poster boy who's an individual,
Right.
to do that, and that is just very inefficient. It's very counterintuitive. It is nonsensical. Even when you think about the best way to organize something in your, for example, in your university with friends, for example, or colleagues, you put you put things in place where everyone can express their opinions, for example, and that is validating to the individual in itself, right? So without the by validation here, I don't mean I don't know, society, validating you in a bad way, right? In a capitalist way. I mean self-worth. You get a feeling of self-worth, which every single human being needs to a certain extent. So that's why I think that I have this I have this image in my head that, okay, what's like the situation now is terrible under capitalism. If I want to brainstorm about a perfect or near perfect world where we have the best things in place to run it, I'd say if you want to abolish all borders and have one entity, operating entity, not necessarily, as I told you last week, like for example, I'm totally fine, every single, for example, commune making their own internal, also communes making federation. I'm fine with that, but I would like there to be a central connection that plans things in a certain way that maximizes. I know I'm speaking in very vague terms now, and if I had a philosophy professor in front of me, I would have failed definitely. But to maximize quote unquote good things and minimize quote unquote bad things. This approach makes the most sense to me, while being and remaining cautious from that entity because of its history in the previous frameworks of the previous system. But and I always come back to the video games analogy, and the strategic video games analogy. When I mean, I know it's kind of may appear non-related, and it maybe is, but I like to use that as an analogy. Like if you have a strategic video game, for example, Civilizations, or I don't know, any other strategic video games you like. If you play with co-op, yeah, I admit it's way more fun with co-op with friends. But if you play co-op, it would be if you are on a one team, it would be at least it would feel more effort consuming to achieve the same results because of this desync factor, right? While when playing, alone, where you call all the shots and everything is centralized around you, the player, you have much more efficiency, and you have all the information that is out there for you, and you can use them well, and that's my approach.
Yeah, so I guess what I'd like to talk about is so when you say you'd like there to be some like central worldwide framework that like sort of tries to maximize like benevolence of society at large, right? Or the efficiency and like moral benevolency of like the any autonomous region below it, right? I would
Yeah.
say that I'm like, just in the abstract term of there being a central body between all communities on Earth, I would say I'm in favor of that too. However, I don't think that that central body needs to operate along the principles of a state. I think that there's a practical concern of this where I don't think it's possible to have a worldwide body act unilaterally in the interests of everybody if it operates under state principles where there's a certain group of people who are making decisions, even though those people are democratically appointed. Like it just seems to not it seems impossible for there to be any sort of global policy that can be set that adequately reflects the nuance of each individual area's region. There are very certain things like global telecommunications networks, for example, is a big one that do need to be determined at the global scale. But practically speaking, the impact, I would say, that any decision that absolutely needs to be made globally and uniformly is I could see this body having a
Listen,
very very minimal influence. So sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, listen, I can agree with you. I can
Yeah.
agree with you. Let's have a state, for example, that only runs this particular thing, right?
Yeah.
Of course, I'm for expanding that, for example, to things like, for example, space exploration. I mean, in my opinion, that's also has to be centralized to minimize the waste of resources, right? Do you agree?
Sure, yeah, that could be something that's centralized as well.
Right. So me and you can talk right now and find out things that actually works better when centralized, and keep the authority of the state, confined within those frameworks. And for example, the state may not have the authority to override, for example, a commune decision to produce, I don't know, produce potatoes instead of wheat, for example, right? So we can democratically decide that. And I see a question from Phil. How much state does Elias imagine? I mean, it depends. We can decide democratically on what we think should be centralized and what we think should be left to each individual commune or to each also individual. And let's not forget here, even the concept of human rights is humanly made. It's a human made construct. So
Right.
so we can decide, we can collectively decide where those lines are to be drawn, and still have the autonomy that you're after. Of course, I think also, like the most basic implications of democracy is, for example, like you yourself, for example, you want, for example, an X amount of autonomy for each individual. Other person says Y, and you both go vote, and maybe the end result would be somewhere in between, or right. Even in these things, I don't mind, like all these things being democratically rotated and circulated. And the point you said is kind of speaking to my point of, we can put those constraints, like we can only let this state act in those domains. You can't get out of those domains. Like, for example, the telecommunications example that you gave, the space exploration research that I gave, many other things that may be, for example, if a resource, for example, the Amazons, like, what if a commune wanted to cut down the Amazons? There needs to be, like, for example, a central body, like, no, this is actually like, quote unquote, federal land, or whatever, right?
Well, no, hold on. Sorry. With this,
Yeah,
like with that specific example, no, there does not need to be a central body saying to cut down the Amazon. Number one, because I don't believe any individual commune could exert like a legitimate
I
claim
agree.
to the extent of like we have the right as a commune to cut down the entirety of the Amazons. And number two is, as I was getting, like the other problem with like a centralized state institutions is how do they arrive at the decisions they do, even if their decision making influence is limited in scope to like of certain areas. Like let's say we have the global telecommunications bureau that dictates telecommunications matter at the global scale. They don't intervene in anything else. It's the extent of their authority. They still, at some extent, in order to make an equitable decision, you are still like leaving a minority of people in charge of making an equitable decision for the entire planet, which
But
potentially.
but
Sorry, go ahead.
but why does it matter? Why does it matter if they're, for example, as accountable as you would like them to be?
Um, because that's like the process of direct democracy leads us to a more accurate result of what the actual needs are. I'm saying that this group is unnecessary
I agree.
well, this group is what I would like to see instead is like rather than having like an appointed state body of people who draft like the telecommunications laws, I would like to see like individual treaties between separate communes establishing like these sorts of things, linking up in totality to a global network, because what it allows, it allows for people to have a direct say in what their needs are and how they are met, which I don't believe that a singular state institution, especially one that operates at the global scale, can accurately provide. It may be able to make a faster decision than a more decentralized one, but the more decentralized one will in my view have like a more accurate picture of what the individual needs are that need to be addressed by the global system.
Right, but there are I may disagree with you on a point here, which is I don't disagree on the validity of the point. I disagree in opinion, which is, in my opinion, I wouldn't care if someone has authority over me as long as this authority is 100% accountable by me and other people.
So this isn't
Uh,
about sorry. This isn't about like a
yeah,
moral objection to authority. This is about a practical result of this authority being used, right? So when we have like a if we have like a global group that is the authority to dictate telecommunications over everyone, if they're
yeah,
acting benevolently and they're abiding, we have mechanisms to make sure that they're transparent and they're only enacting like this specific legislation. The
yeah.
issue then becomes like how does this group actually make the decisions of how we set up these telecommunications networks? How do we determine like which islands, for example, how do we determine where internet access goes to on different islands? How do we determine there's all sorts of like complicated questions about exactly what the nature of this telecommunications network should be that requires like a very very different number of needs being met from a very very large number of people. So from doing that, like it seems like
Right.
in order to address those needs properly, there needs to be, I would say that like a direct democratic process of um, like telecommunications treaties between local communities. Um, Again, it's slower, but it leads to people's needs being met more sufficiently. Like this isn't, I don't have like an abstract moral concern about authority being enacted over me. I have like practical concerns about the ability of central authorities to make these decisions in a way that is accurate.
Okay, so I think this is a little unwarranted. I don't see. In the world I'm speaking of, I don't see what's the incentive that would make these people, when they're constrained with, for example, telecommunications. I don't see any incentive for these people to do anything malicious. Wouldn't you
No,
agree?
I'm not talking about when I make assumptions about frameworks, I'm trying not to I don't try to assume that the individuals involved are making malicious decisions. You're right, there's no incentive for like a central committee to make malicious decisions. What I'm concerned about is worldwide the vast amount of just data that needs to be considered for every single locale in terms of their specific needs for telecommunications and how to address each of these needs. Like I'm not worried about, oh, the telecommunications bureau hates this island, so they're not going to get internet because of that. What I'm worried about is, oh, this island has like very specific needs because of like a reef nearby that makes getting telecommunications there possible in a way that challenging in a way that it isn't for other nearby islands. And we have a
Right.
special set of needs that needs to be considered. Multiply that by like every single instance of literally the entire planet, and you
Yeah.
encounter a situation that becomes nearly practically impossible to manage centrally, because what you're doing is you're entrusting like a small minority of people does not have the ability to gather all of this data to the extent required to like actually make these decisions in
I
the way
mean,
that competently.
I'm not saying that, for example, if I'm the head of this telecommunication committee, for example, and I'm not the one who's going to go to an island and say, "Hey, here's what you're going to have, one, two, three." Like
Right.
we can still use, but as I told you, there are individual communes, and these communes have experts and have representatives for each domain and for each topic, right? They're directly in contact with the central body I'm speaking of, one way or another, to be able to synchronize all the efforts. Like, for example, if you want to make a giant global telecommunications network, like the example we're going with right now.
Yeah.
But what I don't see happening, what I don't see a problem in, even if one island, like even if each island around the globe has a unique particular situation which requires nuanced attention to the building of that telecommunications network. I mean, this all of these things are solvable by literally, bodies of from this central body, representatives from the central body would meet with representatives from those communes, and they would use the experts that the commune have, for example, at their disposal, to be guided, across this. I'm not saying like one guy or a few guys in I don't know, New York, for example, are going to decide how Hawaii, for example, gonna connect to the
Right.
global network. Yeah, I mean, when I say central, I don't mean literally one dude, giving down all orders to the guy below him, and then so on and so on. What I mean by central, I mean it in a synchronized way, and to have a central body. I hear people like distinguishing between in the chat between government and state. I understand that, and the only thing I have to say is in certain situations, for example, you decide where the state or why the state has this monopoly on force, on using force or violence, right? When we say violence, it's not necessarily that violence won't necessarily be like arrest, right? We can literally build a state without a prison system. We can do that, right? So I'm just saying, like, as an example. In my opinion, this central body, this state, this central body, which gonna have, a monopoly on force for one reason, because the areas where we say to this central body, like, here, you're fully accountable, you're fully, 100% elected by people, and here are your this is this is your jurisdiction, for example. This is your access to authority. This is what you can do. This is what you are allowed to do. And anything beyond that, I would believe, would be decided by globally by people, and by respecting the individual each individual commune, to have a sufficient amount. Actually, it would be almost the same amount of autonomy and agency that I think you'd like in your anarchist world, right? Which is why I don't mind. I'm not really opposed to any anarchist scenarios.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess like that's fine and all, where we have like the global net, like when you say centralized, you like when you say there needs to be a central body for these things. If what you mean by a central body is a centralization of like information and planning, we can
Exactly.
have
Yes.
that sort of information and planning centralized without there necessarily being a state apparatus. I mean, that's just what it like. I don't have any
But how would you enforce that? How would you enforce the decisions with these all centralized information? You reach a certain outcome, a certain result, and you
well,
need to act on it and enforce it. How?
what needs to be enforced? Like, can you give like a more specific example?
For example, if, for example, you have a point, an island. Let's say we assign space travel and space exploration to this central body, for example, and this central body would this space mission would require resources. So this central body says to looks at the global situation and says, where can I get this resource from? Where can I get this resource from? We need that much. We need that much. We need those experts. We need that many workers to work on the facility. We need that many, blah, blah, blah. So all this. So say, for example, a certain expert or certain experts, for example, from from the commune, a certain commune, which is, supposedly the closest commune to the mission site, and it would be, the commune where the mission would, logistics of the mission would mostly take place in that commune, for example. Let's say they wanted, like the experts of this commune disagreed on a detail with the global experts, for example, the experts from the central body. And then, for example, there was a referendum globally of experts on that particular topic, and the central body was correct, for example. The central body experts were, correct in their analysis of the situation, and we should move on according to their plan, not like the local commune's plan. So at this point, do you have a way, like a better way to achieve, the most optimum result possible, other than, having, in this case, in this scenario, that central body saying, okay, we did a referendum. I mean, you opposed our views. We sent you experts. You opposed our views. We did a referendum for experts, and globally it is overwhelmingly, going with our plan, for example. So now you have to comply, right? So I don't see that kind of thing, happening any other way, if you don't want to use some kind of coercion to actually.
On. This is still coercion, if it's coming from, like, there, if we have like a plan that needs to be followed, like, I'm gonna alter your analogy a little bit, because like space exploration seems a little bit abstract to be something that we need everyone to be in compliance with. So let if you don't mind, I'd like to alter the analogy a little bit to have it be like about, like, this is how we fight climate change. We've got a world climate change referendum, and we have like we have like a minority of scientists who have found an incorrect result, and we're trying to like contain that because it has like actual material effects on our ability to save the planet, right? The central body coming forward and saying, hey, we like, I don't see where the central body's authority is less coercive than the ability of like decentralized institutions to be able to go like, hey, you need to cut this. Like, we could still have like the same referendum process where we have scientists over the globe share their information with one another, and from there have a referendum to reach a conclusion about what our plan of action is, and what sort of what is like the correct data in this case. We can still have that global referendum managed democratically without that sort of state body, and then in order to ensure compliance, rather than having a state enact coercive measures, if whoever the offender does not comply, we have a more decentralized form of coercion, where we have individual we have individual communes decide like, hey, if you don't comply with this, we've determined that this is the best course of action. If you don't comply with this, we're going to have to like restrict you from certain benefits that we've been providing you, right? This is the same thing that the state would do, right? We would have there would be like certain consequences for going against this referendum, ostensibly for the good of all, and we can have these same sort of consequences determined democratically as well. But like, this is like it's sort of like, I just don't see how the state is capable of doing this in a way that is less coercive than a non-state.
No, I'm not saying it's the state. I'm not saying the state going to do it in a less coercive way. I'm saying the state will coerce that individual commune, but at least the state is an aggregate for a global, which is, in my opinion, I mean, starting from the premise that all human beings, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, and culture, all human beings are equal, right?
Right.
I think it is useful to in certain domains to have an aggregate of the global human population's opinion on this or that, right? But I didn't say the state would be less coercive.
Okay.
Uh,
Well, then in that case,
but
then I don't see how the state is coercion is more effective than a more decentralized form of coercion that includes the same consequences but is managed directly by the other communes involved.
I'd say the difference is you may have neighboring communes to that commune. If, for example, I mean, it depends on what kind of quote unquote punishment you're willing to, give that rebel commune, for example.
Well, it depends
Can
on
you
what's
expand on that?
yeah, it depends on what exactly is happening, right? So like we can't have like if this is an issue of like, oh, there are climate change deniers in this commune, then I like uh we have we would treat it through like whatever the like we would analyze like the options that, hey, we have we can have these effects on the commune through these ways. What's the most appropriate form of response for this, right? It could mean, hey, we're not going to publish any more data gathered by your scientists because we found that you're not achieving accurate results whatsoever, so doing this would harm public discourse. If they're doing like more active steps, like for example if they're actively like going through and using chemicals in their manufacturing processes that we found cause undue harm on the environment and that other communes have agreed not to use, we could impose like economic sanctions on them until they cease doing it. If they like absolutely are just like burning everything to the ground, we have like some sort of joint military intervention between other communes involved. And yeah, there could be other
Right.
neighboring communes that are sympathetic to their cause, but again, that's like a hurdle that a state institution has to overcome as well. We sort of have like
So, so
it's sort of like we have the same tools. It's just how we use those tools, right?
Right, right. If I understand this correctly, I think there's not a lot like, I mean, you're fine with using authority and coercion when it's, for example, justified, but it shouldn't be from like a central body. It should be from an aggregate body of, communes. Is that accurate?
Well, if this like compared to this state, right? More or less I see them as more or less morally like these sorts of interventions more or less morally equivalent if the state is truly if we have like your ideal state where the state is truly an aggregate of the overall wishes of humanity as a whole, and they have arrived at this particular conclusion. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble thinking because of this fucking bug. So um so we have we have the ideal state set up where it's truly a representative aggregate of the wishes of the people who make up this global state. And we have they have like I view them using coercion as morally equivalent to the people that state is an aggregate of, using the same forms of coercion with the same justifications themselves, right? So we either have the state acting on with the moral authority of having the wishes of the people behind them, or you have the people directly acting upon their own wishes. These are
Right, right.
morally equivalent to me.
Right. You have like you give your scenario a moral high ground. Not by much, but you do view it as morally
No,
above
I
my
view
or
no, I don't have a moral again, given like an ideal form of state, which is what you're describing, which I don't think will happen. But
yeah, 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 yeah.
given like the ideal state, I don't see that if the state is truly representative of the wishes of the people, I don't have a moral opposition with the state performing actions that comply with the wishes of the people who comprise the state. What I have a moral objection to is more is some what I have a practical objection with the necessity of the state to operate on behalf of the people rather than having the people operate for themselves. And
Right.
I have different moral objections to the state, but in this particular instance, the morality doesn't. They're morally equivalent to me.
Right. I don't have the same view of like a state or the state in this particular scenario, for example, as you do. I mean, I can give, for example, many ways that you know I can give you many scenarios that a state would be 100%, like not 100%. Okay, there's always a human factor, but pretty like pretty much accountable, pretty much uh,
Sure.
transparent, pretty much restricted.
Well,
Um,
when we have an accountable, representative, and restricted state that only operates, like if we have an ideal state that only operates directly on the wishes of the people and takes no further excess actions, then my objection to it is like, what is the advantage of the state that can't be provided from
the
people?
advantage is two things. First thing is efficiency, which I think.
Well, efficiency on
You
along what lines?
I mean, you yourself said, like last week and in today's conversation, you said that your approach would be what you're talking about would be slower in, for example, for reasons, right? And
Well,
you know,
I would believe that my approach would be slower because I don't believe that the state will make the decision, will take an adequate amount of time to make the decision. I believe that like the slowness involved in like a direct democratic process is the only possible way to ensure an accuracy in the result of the decision making. Right? If we did have like an ideal, what I see as an ideal state that again like represents the wishes of everyone represented by the state, and takes no oversteps and is accountable for its actions, I can see it taking an equivalent amount of time. Whereas we have a more like a more what I would typically see the state realistically being, the state would make a decision and then the people would live with the consequences of the decision of the state, because they didn't plan for some particular edge case because it was infeasible to bring that up within the confines of the state. I don't I just think when I think of like how do we represent the wishes of everyone involved, especially if it's a global decision, this the only way to make like a decision that like accurately represents people's wishes is to either have them speak themselves in a direct democratic manner or have officials
right.
who are officially powerless collect that same information and then use that to come to some conclusion themselves, factoring in everyone's needs into account, which takes the same, practically speaking, the same amount of time as having people speak directly for themselves.
Right. Except those officials, I did not say they'd be powerless. I'd say they'd be powerful in what we choose them
Right,
being
right.
powerful on,
They're powerful.
and
They
that
are
power is
powerful.
accountable.
Yeah, they are powerful in the
Yeah.
extent that they enforce the rules of the people they represent, and they have the power to do that, but they don't have like
Yeah.
abstract political force that we see today in states.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is going to be my final, maybe my final point for today.
Okay.
And as always, I've enjoyed the conversation, and as always, I'd
Yeah, and
like to do it
yeah,
sometime again.
sure, sure. Yeah,
And
I wouldn't mind speaking to you again too. And I want to make sure that like I've been more combative this week, especially towards the end. I don't mean to like again like
No, no,
99.
no.
Well, what we say
I
is like
do not pick up on
99%.
that
Okay, okay.
vibe.
What we say is like 99% identical anyway, and what we're talking about now is like the end game, right? Um, after you make your point, I
No,
did want to
I
go back
actually,
to
believe it or not,
yeah.
believe it or not, I actually came in here wanting to find disagreements, but it seemed to me like, yeah, that's harder than it looks. But in all cases, uh, 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 I have one final
Sure.
word to say on this, which is the second reason. So I told you two reasons that that would make the central body I was talking about, let's say, uh, efficiency-wise, superior to yours. So the second reason is that there there is bound to be a human conflict, not necessarily in a violent form, a human conflict in people different, living in different areas, different regions of the world, having different perspectives on things. Sometimes also within communes, you'll have individuals producing some sort of conflict or social conflict or whatnot. But at least I'm saying in the individual case, the commune would take care of it. But in the case of these like these differences, in case they are between those communes, right? In case they are between those communes, I personally think that there should be an aggregate body that says, hey, no, actually, this guy is correct in that instance. No, these people are correct in that instance. Or, for example, to literally, you know, at least discuss and centrally find solutions collectively to those problems. Uh, just as an attempt to make a more, in my opinion, a more stable society. As long and again, as long as that authority is accountable and restricted to certain domains and not others, I don't see. Maybe I don't share your concern to that body, but I definitely, agree with most of what you said about the problems and the contradictions that will be produced.
Yeah, okay. I mean, sure. I can sort of see that. I did want to go back real quick because if you've got to go, that's fine. I did want to go back
No,
real
no,
quick.
I still have,
Okay, okay,
I
sorry.
still have like 15 minutes. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, I heard that was your final point. So I want to bring up something else that I think I can bring up. Well, maybe I
Yeah.
can bring it up quickly. And but so way back, we talked a little bit about Lenin, and I wanted to bring up like my primary critique about like Marxist Leninism specifically, and I don't know if this critique is as applicable to your system, right? Or your
Yeah, sure.
ideal. Um, when like Marxist Leninists talk about like the idea of the state withering away into like the socialist state withering away as we achieve communism, this is where
Right.
like the big like the idea of like the class conflict between the state and the communists comes into effect, where in order for the state to wither away to achieve full communism, the state has a vested interest in preventing that from happening. And I don't see any sort of mechanism in Marxist Leninist institutions specifically for the state to wither away when it is time to enact communism. Right? We see, typically speaking, that these state institutions for they operate in a way to meet everyone's individual needs, and it creates a
Yeah.
society that is dependent on the framework of the state in order to survive. So there needs to be like some sort of the only real convincing arguments I've heard is that, oh, there will be an anarchist revolution after the world has become socialist under a Marxist Leninist sense, which doesn't seem it's not a satisfying answer in my or there will be like a communist
That's
revolution.
actually
Yeah.
that's actually I don't see like why you wouldn't be, you know, at least why wouldn't you partially at least agree with that premise? Like it's true. Like if you want, you know, on the scale of idealism, right?
Right.
A society where it's fully functional without you know, without unnecessary authority or hierarchies, right? That's a tad more idealized, maybe, than other. For example, you know, that socialist state would wither away from the point of view of Lenin. So I wouldn't know. For example, in a country like the Soviet Union, why would for example, and why wouldn't an anarchist revolution take place? That would be,
Because I don't like
you
the
know,
idea of baking in a revolution will be required at some point later in the future into your
yeah, yeah.
ideology, because you're
You
just
like,
sort of kicking the can, it seems. Like
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
would
yeah.
like
So
it's a revolution is not a painless process. If there's a, like if there's any potential way, like this seems like
absolutely,
a
yes.
very like huge negative downside to the system if at some point there's going to have to be some sort of violent social upheaval in order to get it to the actual desired end goal of communism, right?
Right, right.
That's
So you're right. So you're right on two accounts here. You're right. The first account is what you said about Lenin, which is that he thought the state would wither away, right? And the way the Soviet state were set up, there was no withering away,
yeah.
like in any foreseeable future, right? But my response to that is that okay, you're right, and I agree with you. But I see no other way for a Soviet state to exist other than the way it existed,
Yeah.
especially with the like it from the start of the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. They literally had no options. Like everything just happened, right? They didn't choose for it to happen. Like they were invaded, a civil war took place.
Well, hold
So
on. So the Bolsheviks were a victim of circumstance to some extent. I agree with that. And like war communism, like the idea of like making certain decisions under war because there's a pressure and you can't properly live up to your like ideals of how you'd like to structure the state. That's sure. I agree that's a big problem that like it has like a very measurable impact on the Soviet Union. There were like a lot of decisions, however, that were made that I don't like. The decisions to start murdering anarchists, for example, seem like over the top
I
to
agree.
me.
I
Like
agree.
there's
I
plenty of
agree.
there's plenty
I
of
agree. Of course.
I don't want to put them as 100% the victim of circumstances because there were some
No, no,
choices that
no,
could
no.
be made. Yeah.
No, of
Yeah.
course, and I totally agree. And that's I feel this is like yeah, like even for me as an Orthodox Marxist, I look at that and say, well, you fucked up there. So yeah, I was saying that you were correct about, you know, the state not withering away. There was no withering away of the Soviet state in any foreseeable future.
Yeah.
The second point, I also thought that I agreed with you, is that when you set up it's like when we first started the discussion, we said like yes, for example, we gave the Cuban example. Cuba had was you can say it was coerced in a certain form of statehood because there was this major superpower a few hundred kilometers away from the country, which was explicitly saying that you know this is unwelcome. And this revolution must end right now.
Right.
So yeah, there are many aspects. You know, maybe I can like I can end on an anarchist note here. Finally, maybe an empirical evidence that would make me say, "Fuck it, I'm an anarchist now," would be for me to see a socialist state that that wasn't successful in any way, shape, or form within the confines of a global. Let me say at least without like if it was in a vacuum, right? So
Right.
so I can't even as I told you, when I look at my country, when I look at any developing country, when I look at any attempt to revolt in anywhere around the world, I cannot sit there and say like, yeah, they should do this and this and that, because there is this major player which is called the United States, which can change the course of history in a matter of using espionage or economic warfare or actually invading the country or many other means to do it. So I feel like the dangers of the state, which are there, and I agree with you that they are there, and we should be cautious when speaking about state. But I think the most dangerous aspects of a state is shown when those states are in competition with each other primarily, and
Yeah.
when those states classify information because they explain it, they justify that, like yeah, we have these Russians, they're our enemies, they're our rivals, so basically the CIA can do whatever they want. Yeah, so that's my the way I feel. I feel like I'm open to abolishing the concept of a state. I just want to see it functioning. I just want to see if it functions properly without external forces working to make it fail.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. Like the data that we have, a lot of our data is going to look like, is like the idea we have some, not much, but some data of how socialist experiments of different creeds succeed or fail in like the conditions of the 20th and 21st century with like large amounts of foreign intervention. You're right, there is basically zero data on how these things actually function in when we like move on to a primarily post-capitalist global system, and that's where things that's where we really can't gather any data until it happens, right? So we're at this point we have to talk about like the only way to have a discussion on this is to talk about theory and to talk about, well, this seems like a logical progression of events that can happen given what we're setting up to begin with, what we're seeding this with. But
Right.
that's not a substitute for like the actual reality that we will see when it happens.
Yeah, but again,
Yeah,
I can rarely like
yeah,
I don't see myself disagreeing with you on theory
yeah.
though, right? So
Right. Yeah.
so
So we have to
yeah,
like, yeah,
so today we had to find, like, we literally actively search for disagreements, and that's okay actually. I personally got more educated about anarchism because of what you said. Now I know more, but yeah, as I said, maybe in a few discussions I could change my mind. I don't know, but I'm sure as hell open to that. But important thing is for me that I'm learning, and as I've said the last time around, anarchism is not well known in my region. It is not a cool ideology. If that's the correct term. Yeah, so everything like I'm hearing from you when you depict an image where you have frameworks in your mind that function in a certain way and make people function in a certain way. I can totally imagine that. just like I said last week, unlike people like Destiny, for example, who just
Yeah.
stands in awe about what you're saying, like it's they. Like as if he really has empirical data that this won't happen, right? Or that this is unachievable. This is just in my opinion ridiculous from his part. For example, I am in no way opposed to any anarchist organization. I don't mind even personally being involved in that. And I am planning to read more literature about it
Yeah, and
in the
again,
future.
like I would say that I have like the same feelings typically about orthodox Marxist and like Marxist Leninist structures where you have a state involved. I don't really have like when there are examples that we can see today of those, well, they're not achieving what I see as an ideal or what you see as an ideal. They're still like actually like directly improving the lives of the people countries compared to comparable other nations in the region. So that's definitely a good thing. Like I'm a form of harm reduction even within. I'm a form of social democracy even within capitalism. So how could I not be in favor of state
Right,
socialism
right.
that that benefits
Exactly.
people's lives? Yeah, I mean that's I mean it was also really interesting hearing from you about like your stance on Rojava, the YPG. That's like some new information for me. That's very helpful. So thank you for speaking on that. And yeah, I will look forward to talking to you some other time and continuing this. If you,
Sure. I
yeah,
have I have just a couple of things to say, if that's okay.
yeah.
Uh, so yeah, I wanted us I wanted to see what you think about several topics. Maybe of course we're gonna do that some other time.
Sure.
But I was I was watching what I missed from Twitch in the past few days, and I saw the Peter Coffin Destiny thing,
Yep.
and yeah, that was Destiny was one of his, was one of the worst forms of that person in that debate. But I just wanted to say that as an advice, he's a professional debater and
Right.
he has a big audience. I don't think leftists with I mean, Peter Coffin is one of my favorite YouTubers. He's intellectually like mind-blowing for me. What he says, the way he puts his videos and whatnot, it's amazing. But he can't debate, and he knows that. He actually put out a video saying that. I think, in my opinion, these debates shouldn't happen with people like Destiny anymore for a reason. He debates to win. He's not in good faith. He doesn't debate. He's not a good faith actor at all. And that's, in my opinion, clear. I just wanted that to be out
Yeah,
there.
I agree with you. For the most part, I will like debating with Destiny in order to try to win, can have like a rigorous like battle of ideas where the more rational side will win out is pointless. I will say that I think people debating Destiny is useful if you keep in mind that you're not debating Destiny, you're debating Destiny's audience, right? Like the goal there is to be on a platform with thousands of people watching where you can get like say like 5% of them to go like, huh, maybe they have a point, and go and they
Mm,
look further into what you're saying, and they go further and further and further until they sort of move past where Destiny is on the left. But that's that
okay.
it's more of like an outreach and recruitment type of thing than a like actual attempt to get Destiny to find the truth, because you're right, I think that's pointless.
Right. I mean, the two best debates I saw against this, I mean, as far as leftist performance, was the Michael Brooks one. He
Yeah.
totally like butchered Destiny in his own game. He won in Destiny's own game. And Lance from the Surfs was awesome. Although he didn't really, like Destiny, didn't really know up until the end that he was actually, getting owned all the time, right? Yeah, that was interesting for me, and yeah, shout out to Lance.
Yeah, no, Lance is great. Lance does probably the most valuable work on Twitch when it comes to promoting other leftists. Like Lance is consistently fantastic at that. Like Lance is big. I think one of the major reasons why we've had, like, in the past few months specifically, such a huge number of people move to Twitch is because Lance is set up and has been promoting smaller streamers like consistently in a very good way. That I think is like incredibly valuable, and the work that he does there is like amazing, top quality. Luna Oi
Right,
was
right.
amazing too. Yeah, Luna.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yeah, Luna. I wish I could say EJ did better in that debate, but Luna kicked Destiny's ass. EJ. So I wanna bring
But
up.
I mean, it's clear that EJ is not a debater, right? I mean,
Well,
it's clear
EJ is not
that
really a debater, and the other half of that I want to bring up is as someone with a little bit of backstory, and I'm not spilling anything that hasn't been said publicly before, but as someone who like knows a little bit of the backstory behind that debate, um, EJ came in because Faraday said something along the lines of, "Hey, would you like to have like an educational discussion with Destiny about anarchism?" And what EJ prepared for was like an educational discussion about anarchism and not what Destiny was doing.
right, right,
So
right,
I don't think debate
right.
is like I don't think debate is EJ's strong suit at all. From what I've seen so far, he's great at a lot of other things. But
I mean,
he
me and you,
also he
I
also
mean, me and
yeah
you, we talk. Yeah,
he
sorry. Me and you just we talk like for a couple of hours, and we mostly agree, and
yeah
yet we find. I mean, at least me personally, I find myself forgetting points all the time and losing my train of thoughts all the time. I wouldn't imagine being against a guy like Destiny,
yeah
who literally, his whole shtick is that I'm gonna make you so confused and so lost to a point that you don't even know what are your thoughts anymore. So yeah.
Yeah, and that's like Destiny gives people a lot of shit for saying that. Oh, he uses rhetoric tactics. Like there's the whole like bad argument tactics meme in his community, where if you ever say Destiny rhetorically speaks in a way that's not conducive to a good conversation, you're like, haha, tricksy debate tactics or whatever. It's like a meme.
Exactly, yeah.
But like it's literally impossible to communicate without rhetoric, right? When I say Destiny uses rhetoric in his debates, that's by
Right, right,
itself,
right.
that's a meaningless statement because using rhetoric is just talking. Like I am using rhetoric if I speak slowly. I'm using rhetoric if I speak really fast. I'm using rhetoric if like I wave my hand. Literally anything I can do to communicate an idea other than telepathically beaming it into your mind, so you just have the idea, is rhetoric. Like there's no way to avoid
Absolutely.
it.
Absolutely. But Destiny, I mean, also an important distinction just is Destiny is not a good faith actor, and that's very different. I mean, you can have rhetoric, you can have debate tactics, and you
Right.
can be a good faith actor. That's not half good, if you want to say. But Destiny is not a good faith actor. He already has preset positions, and he is a grifter.
Yeah.
He's giving, like, listen, you can see his body language in the debate, like whenever, for example, he's frustrated and wouldn't and is not able to get a point across, he starts yelling and making gestures, so his fan club in the chat start
Yeah.
saying absolute. I mean, I also watched the Ben Burgess Destiny debate yesterday. I watched it today, and the chat was like, I mean, just focusing on every single stutter that Ben Burgess does, and
Right.
all owned, like some childish stuff. And this is not, in my opinion, this is not the atmosphere of a productive conversation. I think this is more the atmosphere of a productive conversation. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I mean, Destiny is like he's Destiny. This is sort of like what he was always like, and um yeah,
Please?
you're right. I
You're
don't really have
not,
anything else to add to that. You're
please?
right. Destiny's chat is very
Yeah.
reactionary. Yeah, that's true. Is the thing like Destiny's chat sometimes bothers me way more than Destiny does. Like when Luna was on, and she has like a very thick Vietnamese accent, given that she's from Vietnam. And
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
if you watch that debate and you look at the chat the whole time, it's like just like outright completely racist garbage. And
It's just disgusting.
yeah,
It's just
yeah,
disgusting stuff.
and he makes no effort to curtail that until it starts reflecting poorly on him, and that's the only thing he's concerned about when it comes to his community. But yeah. Anyway, I
Yeah.
actually would yeah. That's. I think we mostly agree on Destiny. Was there anything else that you had? Because I'm sort of sick of talking
No,
about him.
no, I actually, yeah, I understand. So I actually need to go. It
Yeah.
was again, it was a blast talking to you, and hope we do this again. And same. So I'll talk to you during the week if I'm up for a weekend chat, and we'll do it.
Alrighty, sure thing. Yeah. I would be absolutely down for that. Yeah. Have a good one.
You too, man. Take care.
All right.
Take care, everybody.
Bye bye.
Bye.